Okay, we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you joining us today. We're about to start our discussion on ESG Controversies, a comparative study of public versus private sectors. This one is actually based on a proprietary research study by our ESG and research teams at SESAMm, and we'll be publishing an ebook on the same topic with many more details than the webinar today shortly, so stay tuned for that. Our webinar today will be led by Sylvain Fortem and Alexandre Thiesset. Sylvain is the co-founder of SESAMm and has been the CEO for 10 years since the company was started. He is an expert on anything in the intersection of AI and ESG. On the other hand, Alexandre has extensive experience in sustainability, first with Robeco and more recently at Moody's, and he is now the head of ESG at SESAMm. Please feel free to write down any questions you may have during the presentation. You can use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll have a dedicated session at the end of the webinar to answer all those questions. And please enjoy the session. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Sylvain Fortem.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for everyone for joining. I see a lot of familiar names, so thanks to our clients and partners that are joining the call today. What we can start with now that Jorge has done the introduction is just a quick intro on the company. There may be some people that don't know SESAMm yet. And then we'll dive into this very interesting topic of corporate controversies and comparison between public and private sectors. Jorge, I still see the same slide. Let's maybe check that we can go to the next one. I don't know if that's just on my side.
Did you see?
I just see slide one
the
for now.
Introduction slide? No. Can someone please let us know if on the chat what slide you see? Do you see the introduction slide? Just want to make sure.
Only slide one for now. ESG Controversies, a comparative study.
Huh. I'm actually moving. Let me see. Cover slide. Yes. You know what? I'm going to stop sharing and I'll start sharing again.
Okay, no problem. And in the meantime, just a quick introduction on SESAMm. So SESAMm is a company that was created in 2014, so almost 10 years ago, like Jorge said. We're a team of around 100 people. We raised $50 million in capital as a venture-funded company. And we specialize in ESG controversies using AI. So that means we use AI, in particular now generative AI algorithms, to automatically detect scandals that may occur on public and private companies. We're an international company, so as you may hear, our head office are in France, and most of our team is based there. But we also have a team in Tunisia, one in New York, one in London, and one in Tokyo. So a very international company. And one of our specialties at SESAMm is working beyond public markets, in particular into private equity and private credit. So we work with 7 out of the top 10 private equity firms in the world, including some public names like Carlyle or Warburg, for example, and also consulting and rating agencies such as ERM, EquiFinance, Fitch, and many others. And so this repositioned us in the right place to do that comparison between public and private assets, because SESAMm is one of the few data sets that is available at scale on private equity and private credit, typically asset classes where there is a lack of public information and where it's really tough to get comparative analytics. So the challenges that we really want to address today is doing a study that properly compares public and private asset sectors, despite the lack of information in private companies. There's one further complexity here is that many ESG data sets are proprietary, as you know. And so for us, having coverage of both asset classes allows us to do this comparative analysis. And the last thing is, and you'll see that on the next slide, is a lot of difficulty and challenges also come from the biases that exist and the differences between these markets. So typically there's a huge size bias that exists, and controversy detection algorithms have to compensate for that in order to create a study that is statistically significant. So these are really the challenges that we want to address. And now in terms of, on the next slide, how we address them and some of the key objectives that we want to tackle. So we're going to use AI to extract controversies. So again, incidents specifically negatively impacting companies on both public and private companies. To do that, we're going to use our proprietary engine called Text Reveal, in which we can track more than 25 billion documents across 4 million plus sources. This includes premium and public media, NGO websites, industry blogs, company forums, reports, etc. And we track this around across 15 plus years of historical data. So we have a sort of large archive of public and premium documents from which we can immediately search for any relevant information and potential scandals that may emerge on companies. Based on this, we track 100 or so different risk categories that relate to specific types of global frameworks, such as the UN Global Compact or the UN SDG. And we do this entirely automatically using AI. So for example, identifying an employee relation issues, ethics issues, or a cybersecurity breach, for example, or data privacy issue. And so by doing that using AI, we can scale on assets that, of course, no one can track manually, especially private assets. And so we scale that across millions and millions of private companies. So we do this ESG controversy assessment. We also do some positive impact news for some of our clients. So looking at positive exposure to sustainability topics. And here, the key things that we have to take into account for this specific study is properly normalizing the data, removing the biases that may exist, especially these biases that relate to private market, where the sectors may be different than what we typically have as a classification in public markets. But most importantly, our algorithms have to detect smaller companies' issues, be able to be robust to low volume companies, basically, for these SME types companies. We're then going to associate all controversies to specific sectors and type of events in accordance with the global framework. And we will then analyze the similarities and differences with regards to these types of events. And finally, the last step of this study is more of just a case study. We're going to dive really deep into the example of IKEA, because we feel it's a good example of a private company, but that is very large, plus has a CSR policy. And so we'll dive into this specific topic. So that's the plan for today. We hope it's going to be an interesting discussion for you, and we can go to the next slide. All right, so Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvain. So this study aims to compare the nature of controversies in both listed and private market companies. So we took care to have as many articles in the two buckets. So that's why we have first a bucket of 1.5 thousand companies, which are part of the large cap listed companies, and 3.5 thousand companies on large cap private. Because they are private, they are a bit smaller on average, and that's why we have that difference of a number of companies to have as much articles on the same buckets. We also took care for sample to have good sector representativity, and also we have been able to correct the size bias by detecting severe controversy. We have different approach to capture severe controversies for example, smaller companies. A single case or single article can qualify a controversy case, while for some other company, bigger company, we will need much more documents, possibly hundreds or 1,000 documents to qualify through controversies. And that's because Sylvain said our algorithms are very robust on low volume companies. A second metric that we use in this study is the intensity. The intensity score is a metric at the event scale, and it is defined by a decision tree that is fully transparent, and it comprises as a major metric the negative sentiment that our algorithm are able to capture, and the volume anomalies. The intensity score ranges from 0 to 5, and a 5 will be an event that is perceived as very negative from the stakeholders, and have been spread very largely on the web. So if you go on to the next slide, we'll start analyzing our study. So first of all, we observe that listed and non-listed companies face different issues. Public companies face more environmental cases, especially in the fossil fuel sector. Can be illustrated by the BP and the Shell major oil spill in the state of Washington for BP and in Nigeria for Shell. And for public companies, we believe that it can be there can be a kind of environmental momentum that exists for the controversy because of the increased consciousness of the environmental issues from the civil society, also via the mass media, and also due to some dedicated niche media and NGO that are very dedicated on environmental violation that put the light on those violations, especially for very high impact sectors such as the fossil fuels, as we can see. On the private company side, we can see that they face a bit more governance issues that are in purple on the slide. In our opinion, that's because private companies are not listed, does not have the same regulatory listing requirement that require for listed company to have very sound governance bodies that private company are more free and does not certainly have. So they cannot apply, or they do not apply the best practices of governance, and that can explain why we have a larger proportion of governance issues for the private companies. If we go now, can we go back, please? Yes, I would like to mention the case of fossil fuel and financial company on the private market side. For example, FTX and Binance that face major issues related to corruption and money laundering. That were major cases in the recent months. So these are typically governance issues. And also we mentioned that for corporate companies, a single event that we mentioned previously can quickly gain the attention of the public, while for large companies, all the event does not have the same intention. Only the most severe event will catch as much attention than for private companies, and that's why we need to correct that bias. Now we can move on to the next slide. This is a deep dive on the environmental issues. So the environmental pillar is composed of all the components of the environment. It can be the atmosphere, the biodiversity, the water, land, soil, and also the management of waste by the company. So we can harm, a company can harm directly the environment, such as the company Perenco, a private fossil fuel company that recently been involved in the major oil spill. Or it can be also indirect. So for example, for Barclays, for example, it has been facing controversy because some banks, some churches and charities decided to stop their relationship with the bank because of their financing of the fossil fuel industry. So they have been involved in environmental controversy indirectly. And also our categories are also able to cover events that are least accurately qualified in environmental components, or also attached to the strategy of the company. So when a text is not very clear on what part on the environment has been harmed, it will be also classified in our model, but it will be in the general environmental strategy category that will capture all the different general allegations toward the environment. It's especially the case for mass media that are not very qualified to deal about specific violation of environmental. For public company, there is a focus on atmospheric emission or water pollution because those events are maybe or on larger scale. So larger company will impact the environment at a larger scale, so the atmosphere directly or the water, whereas for smaller company, the impact is more localized. And we have an event, a specific event for the company PetSmart that faced a very huge backlash because they throw away in the dumpster living fishes in a hideout store. So it is a violation on the animal welfare. So the biodiversity component, but this is very much more localized. Then we can move on to the next slide, when we will be talking about the social pillar. The social pillar has multiple stakeholders, such as the employees, can be also the civil society, or the customers. In the social pillar, we capture basically also the violation of the fundamental human rights that are dictated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN, signed in 1988. And this includes also the right to privacy. For the fossil fuel sector, for example, there is a large proportion of controversy that are related to human capital issues. And we think that this is most likely due to massive strikes and layoffs that occurred at Shell last year. There have been very large cases at Shell. They have been cutting a lot of jobs, and there have been massive strikes that occupy a lot of the attention of the fossil fuel sector because of Shell. But also for private company, we have the company Citgo, that is a subsidiary of Petróleos de Venezuela, that faced an issue related to helping the drug traffickant to move money out of the US. So it can be classified as a violation of basic human rights, because the drug traffic is linked to very severe violations of human rights. On the consumer discretionary private, we spotted a lot of cases related to the customer relation, which is logical due to the sanitary requirement on this sector. So quite logical. And for IT companies, on both private and public, we count a number of controversies linked to the privacy, in the same way that Google, for example, in the this very time, has been facing a 5 billion lawsuit because they have been alleged to track the people even in incognito mode. This can be qualified as a privacy violation that is accountable for the fundamental human rights. And also human rights is also a challenge for private companies, especially Binance, that we already mentioned earlier, that allegedly participates in the financing of the terrorist organization Hamas by 7 former Israeli hostages. So this allegation have popped recently on the media, and we capture it. Now we can move on to the next slide, the governance pillar. So the governance pillar will account all the controversies linked to the governance bodies of the companies, such as the board of directors, the executive committee, but also the processes in place in the company. Can be the audit and control processes, also the tax strategy, anti-competitive practices, corruption, and also the lobbying and influence strategy. So if we compare private and public company, we observe that the first challenge that are faced are linked to corruption and anti-competitive practices, while public companies face more focused on management issues. So in sector like the financial and industrial, the public entities grapple with strategy and compliance, whereas private firms are concerned with tax strategy. For example, we have the case of Vista Equity that allegedly moved millions of dollars in offshore platforms without paying the US taxes. And for example, in fossil fuel industries and the utility sector, there is a distinction in corruption issues and it can be illustrated with the company First Energy, that is a listed company, which have faced a scandal because they have been caught to pay bribes to local authorities, and especially the speaker of a representative chamber.
And if I can interrupt, just to say a quick word, I think these examples are really important at SESAMm because they show also the diversity of use cases that are covered. Typically, what people do with this data is they would use that to monitor public or private companies like assets. But we also see LPs monitoring GPs. So we gave the case of a private equity firm. This is also used to monitor not just underlying assets of GPs, but also the GP's own reputation and potential issues. So this is a tool that is more and more in the hands of LPs directly. And as we'll see later, there's the monitoring aspect. This also applies in the supply chain segment for corporate to start tracking their own supply chain. And there are a number of different regulations related to that. But it also applies to due diligence. So all of these issues, we have lots of teams, either private equity firms that are using us directly for the initial due diligence process, just doing a quick check before going to investment committee. And also a lot of consulting firms, we mentioned some of our partners here, and I know some of you guys are on the call, using the platform in order to do the initial reputational check before diving into more consulting type work and providing recommendation and a deeper due diligence. So these are really the two main use cases with monitoring of assets or of suppliers, and also on due diligence. But as you can see, it scopes a lot of different types of firms and a lot of different types of use cases and issues that can be targeted. Just a comment in passing.
Sylvain, absolutely. It's absolutely key to have such a deep data lake to cover all the issues, and thanks to the billions of documents we have, we can cover basically every company at the smaller scale. Even a very small startup, we can cover the risk they may face with the variety of stakeholders we cover. So maybe we can go on to the next slide and discuss about a bit of the SDG framework that has been initiated in 2015 by the United Nations. And this framework is widely used for implementing thematic investing strategies for specific goals such as gender equality, climate action, or water, for example. Some examples that are really widespread. And we believe it's also useful to use that framework, can be used not only to spot positive ESG events, as we are able to do, but also following the double materiality standard that is very important in Europe. Use the principle that we call DNSH, for do no significant harm. And to this purpose, we suggest to use the SDG framework to also reveal the negative contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we think this can be also the opportunity for the investment strategies that can be both on public asset or private asset to give a higher level of assurance for investment strategies that use the SDG framework. And I give also always this example, the example of the car manufacturer Tesla. It can be considered acting positively for SDG 13, for example, climate action, because they are manufacturing electric vehicle in their product range, even if 1,000 horsepower individual car is questionable. But on the behavior side, we can observe that there is some issues, for example, related to racism on the factories, which is clearly harming the goal number 10, which is reducing the inequalities. So at this time, can we consider Tesla as a positive SDG investment? So we bring this information to the investor and a new perspective to embrace an SDG strategy. And that's typically the case of one of our clients that is using this tool specifically that way to map the negative SDG contribution. And so another word related to the SDG, when we remark that all sectors, and regardless of the status of the company, they are facing the SDGs issues, and mainly related to goal 1, no poverty, that is mainly associated with the violation of labor rights, also violation of tax strategy, tax evasion or tax optimization. And companies such as financial or fossil fuel or also IT are also facing violation of goal number 16, so peace, justice, and strong institution. And this is the SDG screening on the behavior side, so a negative behavior side. This is an opportunity, and especially for the private equity funds, to directly engage with the company, and so that they can enhance their corporate behavior. So that's not only a screening to be performed, there is also an engagement that can bring much more impact than simply screening out companies. The goal is really for PEs to address the challenges we can spot with the SDG violation. To, for example, if we have a violation in labor rights, to encourage the venture company to adopt a sound policy and sound principle to better manage the fundamental labor rights and to pay their tax properly, if we mentioned the problem we faced previously. And that's it for the SDG. I will hand over to Sylvain for the next slide.
Great, thanks a lot, Alexandre, and thanks for the very specific example. I think it's helpful to really understand what these types of issues are. And a quick comment on the UN SDGs. So as Alexandre mentioned, there's the positive and the negative side, but the positive side, in many cases, we don't aim to look for like revenue alignment with SDGs. In a lot of cases, our clients use this to also find good stories on their portfolio companies in the private equity world, or on their clients when it's in the consulting work. And so it's interesting to see also ESG not just with the prism of risk, but also with the prism of impact. And without going into too aggressive communication or anything, in a lot of cases, that information is similarly helpful to engage with portfolio companies directly, and also compliment them on good stories, share that with LPs and the like. So it's one use case that our private equity clients share with us. Now, on a more negative note, we're going to go into very big issues. So that's UN Global Compact issues. So these are extremely severe events. Oftentimes, tracking the UN Global Compact is a requirement under several different regulatory frameworks. And to illustrate some of these types of events, which are really a bit hardcore, I wanted to give the examples from the UN Global Compact breach Q3 engagement update from last year, just to highlight a few examples and for you to really feel what these types of breaches are. So, for example, the company Yongor Group, public textiles and clothing enterprise in China, the Global Compact raised concerns about the presence of forced labor in its global supply chain and connection to human rights violations, in particular in Asia. And that same company had also been exposed to a large pollution scandal in 2011, so it was not their first time being on the radar. And similarly, Ofilm Group, which sells manufactures camera modules in China. The UN Global Compact expressed specific allegations of forced labor related to employing ethnic minority through coercive labor transfer program, basically meaning Uyghurs work. And the company was already under US sanctions from 2020 for this same behavior. So these are really the type of extreme events that we aim to cover with UN Global Compact related alerts. And there's one thing to be said about this is signatories of the UN Global Compact are actually still likely to breach, or as likely, or we could argue more likely in some cases, to breach the UN Global Compact. And our partner, AT Finance in Europe, has published a very interesting study showing that UNGC signatories are not immune from UNGC violations. And they did a sample analysis on 2,000 or so companies, and 68% of companies assessed that were not aligned with UNGC principles were signatories of the UNGC. And I think we have that same kind of topic in a lot of these frameworks, and also in supply chain. Is signing a document is not enough to guarantee that companies respect these agreements. And it's good to have that outside view and look, especially at media and journalists that are doing a great job at covering these scandals and identifying controversies, and similarly NGOs. And so the main conclusions related to our study on the UN Global Compact is private companies in the industrials and fuel sectors are linked to UNGC anti-corruption breaches. And again, we see that this may relate also to kind of the lack of compliance or supervision frameworks for these companies. Public utilities and private basic materials sectors face a lot of environmental UN Global Compact breaches, which is expected in these sectors. And public companies across sectors, such as consumer staples, for example, encounter a lot of human rights violations. So these are big topics under the UN Global Compact. Public entities generally experience more frequent or more severe UN Global Compact breaches than private companies. They are also really heavily under scrutiny. And again, there is under several different frameworks a mandate to report on these events. And so there is a lot of very close attention being allocated to this. So very extreme events, again, here the use of controversies detection is very helpful to make sure that companies are kind of walking the talk in that context and not just signing the UNGC principle. We can go to the next slide. And so in the next slide, we're going to go into a case study. So as mentioning before, we're going to go into the use case of IKEA. And the reason why our team chose IKEA is because it's a very big firm. It could be listed, but it is not. So it's interesting to see there's a difference there. And also it's perceived as having a very proactive CSR policy and ESG policy. So it's a good opportunity to understand if there are any challenges to that. And also IKEA has been, and that's not due to our study, but IKEA has been in the news recently, just yesterday and last week. And so we'll mention some of these events that were divulged by media. So we can go to the next slide. So what we show statistically speaking is that IKEA shows low but slightly higher levels of environmental controversies than the consumer discretionary sector average. And 1 week ago, for example, there was a documentary on a French-German channel Arte, which was called IKEA, the Lord of the Forest, which described IKEA as a kind of champion of greenwashing in the context of deforestation. And they really denounced the devastations of intensive forestry. They denounced the practices of the furniture giant. And so this was a quite impactful event for IKEA, and a full documentary, which was really interesting. So that's really on the environmental side. The whole sector is exposed to some issues. It remains minor compared to other topics. A big topic for IKEA, and even bigger than the rest of the consumer discretionary sector, is social risks, which includes product safety issues, human rights breaches, data leaks, illegal filming, for example, was a problem for IKEA, labor rights violation, discrimination, human capital, and customer relation incidents, which is very common in that sector, overcharging or discrimination, for example. And one example related more to data privacy for IKEA in 2021, IKEA France specifically was sued over alleged privacy violations, and they had to apologize for infringing data privacy of staff specifically. So they were found guilty of collecting staff members' private data, and they had to apologize for this. So this is typically an example that would fall under this category. We know that data breaches, data privacy breaches are sometimes categorized as social or governance risks. In this specific case, we put them in the social bucket, considering the right to property that exists under a lot of framework. But we remain quite flexible in the way that we deliver the data for clients to adapt that to their own framework. And in terms to governance risk, it's slightly less common for IKEA than for the rest of the industry. So that implies that there tends to be good compliance processes in place for the firm and or slightly less scrutiny than on public market players. We can go to the next slide. So here on the next slide, we care more about specifically the SDG lens on the negative side. So there are no big surprises, I'd say, specifically for IKEA. Like Alexandre was describing, many companies are exposed to risk related to the SDG goal number 1, which is end poverty. And so it's typically labor rights issue, human capital issues that are covered here. We also see that IKEA faces specific challenges under goal 3, health and well-being, due to product recalls, workforce health and safety concern, of course. And they also show relatively high controversy levels in goals 11 and 12. So sustainable cities and responsible production and consumption. So typically product safety issue, human capital issue, again, in these specific topics. But not all is bad. They have fewer issues on goal 9, industry, innovation, infrastructure, fewer issues on goal 16, peace, justice, strong institution compared to the sector. So there seems to be also better risk mitigation in these areas. And again, on these topics, I want to share very recent news. So less than 24 hours, maybe slightly more than 24 hours ago now, in New Zealand, IKEA was accused of monopolizing land and threatening indigenous ecosystems. And they were accused of having purchased more than 23,000 acres of land in New Zealand to plant pine trees in the hope of offsetting CO2 emissions, but doing that on indigenous ecosystems. And so these are the kinds of controversies that IKEA is regularly exposed to. And I would guess that the study has been run around months ago. If we rerun it right now, I would guess that the level of controversy related to environmental topic on IKEA has just jumped with the documentary last week and this news just yesterday. And we can go to the next and last slide of the study. So here we analyze the controversies under the UNGC framework and principles for IKEA specifically. And so we know that we identify risk related to human rights breaches, for example, multiple instances of privacy, security, dignity violations. And so we see that IKEA in most cases is going to be lower on these scales than the industry average, which is a relatively good sign, as in this case, we specifically consider very severe issues. So I think this also nuances the previous analysis and the very first part, where we were looking at all controversies related to IKEA, where in some cases they were slightly higher, especially on the social side. This is not the case on very impactful and severe breaches that we're tracking here under the UN Global Compact. There are still a few, and I want to mention one, for example. In 2022, IKEA suppliers were accused of using forced labor in Belarusian jails. And this is not level 1 analysis. This is more looking at suppliers. But as we can see here, this typically falls back under the responsibility of IKEA. And we know that CS3D, etc., if it's implemented in the future, could have an impact on this. But right now in France, we have devoir de vigilance. In Germany, there's the German Supply Chain Act, and there are other similar regulations in Europe. And so it's also important to use this analysis not just at company level or at asset level, but also for supply chain analysis. And lastly, on the environmental side, so we see a few more environmental topics for IKEA under UNGC than for the rest of the sector in that case. And it's mostly related to greenwashing allegations, gas leak, illegal logging, etc. So these kinds of issues that we described before. So yeah, depending on the framework, level of severity of events that we look at, the data speaks also in slightly different terms. So this is all for our study. I hope this was insightful, the comparison of public and private assets. So as explained, this can be done on public companies, private companies, suppliers, clients. So there are a lot of different use cases when it's feasible to do this on any kind of company of any size and any sector. So we hope you appreciate the presentation and very happy to go into questions.
Thank you, Sivan and Alexandre. Very insightful presentation. So now it's time for a Q&A. Please feel free to type any questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll address as many as possible. We'll give it a couple of seconds. We have a couple of questions already here, so I'll start with the first one. Given the differences in ESG exposure between public and private sectors, what specific strategies do you recommend for private equity firms to effectively manage and mitigate ESG risks in their investment portfolios?
I think the answer depends on whether it's about public assets and or private assets. So in private equity and private debt, my first recommendation would really be to implement a controversy monitoring system. So in public assets, for Article 8, Article 9 fund, it's a requirement. So usually there's at least a certain level of implementation. But for private assets, oftentimes it's actually not the case. So we think this is really something that is a best practice and that is important. It's also useful in the context of PRI reporting. LPs are using these tools. And the advantage is it also has operational value just to find out about controversies on portfolio companies, as they can represent existential risks for some of these companies. In public assets, I think it's interesting also to question the basic data. So the advantages of tools like that of SESAMm is that you have a bit more granularity, so you can kind of get back to the raw data and not just rely on a simple score. So that has advantages. And I would say it's also interesting to really centralize the monitoring inside an ESG team. That may seem obvious on the public asset side, but in private assets, we see quite often that monitoring issues remains a sort of deal team task, and that's not ideal. Usually it's good to have a team centralizing everything, an ESG team or communications team, rather than relying on each individual deal team, knowing that deal teams also sometimes don't have the same so it's not their responsibility, or they are not biased towards reporting these issues specifically. And then defining specific engagement mechanism, what happens if in these specific situations. So these are really interesting steps. And I think that doesn't stop at investment portfolio level. It's important also to do this at supply chain level, and not just for monitoring, but also due diligence. So a lot of our partners are doing an amazing job on the consulting side, incorporating this data into their ESG due diligence reports, because it's really good to have that reputational view as quickly as possible during the due diligence process.
Thank you, Ivan. We have another question. It says, you have measured the controversy level in terms of percentage of mentions, but how do you take account of the severity level of these mentions? Thank you.
Very good question, and thanks, Emmanuel, for asking it. So as you know, at SESAMm, we have a score of severity. We call it intensity. We try not to make too many claims with regards to materiality or severity. It is a quantitative score that takes a variety of parameters to do that sort of pre-assessment of severity. And we have two ways of considering the information. Either we aggregate all mentions and we say, let's just take the raw number and divide by the total number of mentions of the company itself. This, by the way, eliminates part of the size bias and sector bias, because at least you divide by the total number of mentions of the company, so you identify the anomaly. Or we also weight that by severity. So typically in our dashboards, for example, the ranking is weighted by level of severity. So companies are ranked not just by the number of incidents, but also how critical these incidents are, because it's actually okay having a company more in the B2C segment, has a lot of followers, that has a lot of very small incidents that may be less critical than having a company exposed to one single very severe incident like a child labor accusation. So we can do both. Typically, we tend to weight the number of mentions by the severity level with that scale of 1 to 5.
Thanks, Ivan. One more question. Looking ahead, how do you see the role of AI and text analysis evolving in the monitoring and assessment of ESG controversies? What advancements in technology or methodology can we expect from SESAMm in the near future to enhance our ESG evaluation capabilities?
I'd say AI today is quite essential. Realistically speaking, a lot of industry participants are still using Google Alerts in order to track these events, and it's not an efficient way and not a best-in-class strategy anymore to track these types of events. So I think AI provides a very good answer to this, because up until recently, there were not a lot of tools that could be applied to the private equity market due to lack of data. Now with AI and generative AI, it's much easier to do this and to avoid the kind of data overflow that you would get with Google Alerts. And same thing for consulting teams. We know your work very deeply. We know what you do day to day. And doing this kind of analysis with search engines and the like, I think is not sufficient anymore, because there are many controversies that can be missed without applying AI. In particular, like in Eastern European languages, in Russian, etc. We have a lot of people that tell us it's not sufficient to just use basic search. It's interesting to have more capabilities and also just broader coverage. So I think this is the first thing right now. We don't need to wait for the next steps of AI to derive value from these tools today. And we can expect immediate values. And basically immediate values is tracking assets that no one else can track. That's typically what AI can do. Assessing information in languages that no one speaks in your firm, Eastern European languages, Asian languages, etc. These are very vanilla use cases for AI. And you were asking also about new developments. So we have a couple of exciting ones right now in our roadmap. So there are some that are very low-hanging fruits. Right now, we get a lot of requests of ranking our data by source authority in order for consultants and private equity firms to be able to report on the highest reputation sources. So first report on an international journal, etc. So this is a request that we have all of that data, both from premium data sets and public data sets. But in the past, we tended to rank that more by readability of the content. This is a fast-moving feature where we will provide source authority rankings, so for people to be able to quickly report with the top link, top content. So this one is important. And there's another one that involves a lot of AI for us, which is the case level aggregation. So what SESAMm does right now is we track individual incidents, such as a greenwashing allegation or a lawsuit, a settlement of that lawsuit, etc. And some of our clients are asking for us to aggregate cases where there are multiple material developments over time. So for example, a lawsuit, it's starting, there's the accusation, the lawsuit is launched, and then there's a settlement 3 years later. Right now, we don't provide the aggregation of these events, but we are working on it, and so it should be ready in the coming months, and we have a very good technology for that. So these are some of the two key topics, and then continuing to push also just on supply chain monitoring. We get more and more requests on that, and we think it's important for all types of market participants, and we see this use case also expanding for our own consulting clients. So they get more and more requests on that. So we want to make sure that we support them. So yes, there's going to be a lot of exciting product developments. We deliver features every 3 weeks, and we have a great development.
Thanks, Ivan. No more questions. So I guess we're going to stop here. Any final remarks from either Sivan or Alexandre?
I just wanted to thank our team, our ESG team and our research team for this study. I think it was really great. So thanks, guys, and congratulations. And for everyone, remember that at any point you can engage with us, request a demo or a trial, and we'd love to explore your use cases. And for existing clients and partners, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate working with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ivan. Thank you so much, Alexandre. Great presentation. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope it was as valuable for you as it was for us. As Ivan said, if you want to learn more about SESAMm, you can go to www.sesamm.com. There are a lot of resources there that you can, further your understanding on AI, ESG, and the use cases. For those who would like to revisit the webinar or share it with colleagues, we're going to be sending the recording soon. And as I said, we have an ebook coming on the same topic, so we'll be sharing that with you too. Please feel free to get in touch with us with any questions or comments. Thank you once again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Have a great day.
Thank you
very much.